So you just completed your simulation and you just answered some questions about amplitude. And now I want to show you a couple of slides that um, will continue to explain what waveforms are like and how amplitude is shown in waveforms. So when we look at this slide, we notice a wave. We notice the straight line in the background, and then we notice the peak here. We notice that this arrow is representing the height of the wave, which is, we go back to our definition of amplitude. Amplitude, we know that the amplitude is how tall a wave is. So when we look at these arrows, it's showing us if this amplitude is small, medium, or large, and based on the simulations that we just that we just observed, we are able to know that this is actually a medium. This is actually a medium sound wave. This is a medium amplitude because this height is not very large and it is not very small. So we need to remember that we were able to change the waves in our simulation by changing the amplitude slider. And I want us to continue to remember that amplitude has to do with how quiet something is and how loud something is. So let's go to the second slide here, because this is actually a little different. It's combining two different simulations, right? So we remember the simulation with the orange dots. And when we played an instrument, we noticed that the orange dots started moving around. And when they moved around, they actually started colliding. In our last lesson, we were able to understand, in answering that last big question, that when particles are colliding, they are actually transferring energy. So whenever we see the patterns that we see just like right here and in our other simulations, when they get into these lines, we notice that they're colliding. And again, when they're colliding, energy is being transferred. So I want us to pay attention to the pattern that we see, in addition to paying attention to the waveform, because I'm noticing that every time the waveform peaks, meaning every time the waveform gets a little higher here and it dips here, I'm noticing a pattern of colliding particles right underneath it. So if we start here, we have colliding particles right underneath this peak. Particles that are colliding right underneath this peak, so on and so on. So when we combine these simulations and when we combine our thinking, we're now making these connections that every time we see a peak, there must be a pattern of particles that are colliding, that's transferring energy, that's getting from one place to another. So this sound, whether it starts on the right side or the left side, every time the waveform peaks, there's a collection of particles that's colliding, that's transferring energy, that's allowing that energy to move from one place to another. So remembering, as we're learning and the more we learn, we need to think about making those connections, because that's what's going to help us answer the big question. When you get to your assignments, I want you to notice that I want you to remember the connections that you made in your simulation, as well as this video when we talked about the two different waveforms in those two different slides. When you get to your assignment, you're going to have a wave printout, and you're going to need to be able to remember which wave form represented a medium amplitude, which waveform represented a loud amplitude, and which waveform represented a quiet amplitude. The smaller the amplitude got, the more quiet the sound got. The louder the amplitude, the larger the amplitude got, the louder the sound got. So you need to remember those connections when you're completing your classwork. I want to go ahead and quickly sum up our big question here. How can we tell one sound from another? Well, we've learned from today's simulation and today's videos that when sound waves have different amplitudes, we hear sounds with different volumes. When we think about volumes, we think about quiet, we think about loud. So that's what that means when you think of volumes. So again, to sum up today's lesson, when sound waves have different amplitudes, whether the amplitude is small, whether the amplitude is medium or large, we hear sounds with different volumes. It's either quiet or it is actually going to get louder.